Well, hello everyone. Welcome to ForeFlight and Flight Simulators. My name is Ryan McBride. I am the lead product designer at ForeFlight. And I am joined today by Chris Palmer, CFI and founder and CEO of Angle of Attack. Hey, Chris.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. It's going to be a really cool presentation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. The topic today is obviously flight simulation, a topic that is near and dear to me, as I know it is to you, Chris.
hmm
I sort of started my passion for aviation through flight simulation. When I was a kid, my parents, I was lucky enough to get a computer, and my parents got me a Windows Microsoft Flight Simulator 95, which looked a little bit something like this. For folks who have been using flight simulators for a long time, this might look familiar. This is the default scenario in Flight Simulator 95. So put you on the runway at Meigs Field in Chicago. And simulators have come a long way since then, but they were really a gateway for me into real world aviation. They really got me inspired in the space, and I learned a lot just starting off with flight simulators. It's amazing the progress that flight simulators have made, even over the past few years in aerodynamic modeling and graphics. We've come a long way. We've gone from what you see on screen here, Flight Sim 95, to something like this. This is a screenshot from the as yet to be released Flight Simulator 2020. Late last year, Microsoft announced they were getting back into the flight simulation market with Flight Sim 2020. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean later on in the presentation. But the future is very bright for flight simulation. It's really evolved over the past few years. It's become not just a tremendous gateway into real world aviation for aspiring pilots, as it was for me, but it's become a tool that is really a legitimate solution for licensed pilots to keep their head in the game, to stay sharp, practice things, particularly new things. Flight simulation, because it's a simulated environment, a safe environment, something you can do at home. It's a great way to try out new things, whether it's some complicated procedure or flying some new ILS down to minimums. Whatever you want to try, you can do these things in the comfort of your own home on a simulator. And that's true not just for the actual flying, but for other tools, right? So ForeFlight, fortunately, can connect to a lot of the major simulators that are out there. And because of that, you can try out new things, not just in the simulator, but in ForeFlight as well. And we're going to be talking about quite a few of those things today. I want to chat about what I like to call the big three, which are the main consumer off-the-shelf simulators that are the most popular options on the market today, all three of which connect seamlessly with ForeFlight Mobile. The first is called Prepared. Prepared is a tool, a flight simulator tool built by Lockheed Martin. It's actually didn't originally start with Lockheed Martin. When Microsoft decided to get out of the flight simulation market, they licensed the engine, the computer code that ran that flight simulator, to other third parties. And Lockheed Martin was one of those third parties. And so they licensed the computer code and they began to improve it, adding a lot more simulation features, improving the graphics, the performance, adding custom features that were relevant for a lot of Lockheed's customers. Because it's based on the Microsoft Flight Simulator engine at its core, it's a Windows-only product. So in order to run Prepared, you would need a Windows computer. If you're interested in learning more about Prepared and the different features that it offers, you can check out prepared.com. Lots of information there. The next big one is X-Plane. X-Plane 11 is a product developed by a company called Laminar Research, and X-Plane has been out for a long time, but the latest version is version 11. X-Plane is a little unique for a few reasons. The first is that it's one of the only true cross-platform simulators. It runs on Windows, on Mac, and even on Linux, which is pretty unique. X-Plane is also unique in its aerodynamic modeling. So X-Plane uses what's called blade element theory to model aerodynamics as you're flying in the simulator. This is different from some of the more traditional simulators like Microsoft Flight Simulator X or Prepared, in that they use what are called lookup tables. So as the aircraft is modeled and it's flying through the air, the computer is looking up how the aircraft should be performing right now and then making adjustments on the fly. Whereas X-Plane 11 is actually modeling the aerodynamic surfaces of the aircraft in real time. And because of that, a lot of people are very partial to X-Plane for its fidelity in modeling. If you're interested in X-Plane, you can check it out at xplane.com. And the other big one, which is probably the newest one, the newcomer to the space, is infinite flight. One of the challenges I think with flight simulators is that they require a computer to run, whether it's a Windows computer or a Mac computer. Infinite Flight is actually the first true mobile flight simulator experience. So it runs only on iOS. So that means iPad and iPhone. And it's a really incredible simulator experience. It really pushes the performance of the latest iPads and iPhones to their limits. And it's a great way to use the simulator if you don't have a simulator computer, or maybe you're on the road, on the go, and an iPad or an iPhone is just more convenient for you. If you're interested in Infinite Flight, you can check out infiniteflight.com. Lots of information there. But as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, there is a fourth. Microsoft has decided to get back into the simulation market, and flight sim enthusiasts worldwide were overjoyed to hear this news. Here's a couple screenshots from the new flight simulator. It has not yet been released. It is expected to release this year. It's currently in active development. They're doing a couple really unique things in this new version of Flight Simulator. The first is that they're taking a very different approach to aerodynamic modeling. So I mentioned the old Microsoft Flight Simulator and even Prepared use what are called lookup tables. X-Plane uses the blade element theory. Flight Simulator 2020 just takes that to the next level. So incredible aerodynamic modeling in real time, atmospheric modeling, real world weather, and probably, in my opinion, one of the most important things, Azure and Bing data that is streamed directly to the simulator. What this means is that Microsoft's worldwide database of buildings and street addresses and terrain, it's all loaded into the simulator automatically. And it essentially enables, for the first time ever in a desktop computer flight simulator, the closest thing to VFR flight navigation that the flight sim market has ever seen. It's something we're super excited about, and nothing to announce yet in regards to ForeFlight connectivity to this new Microsoft Flight Sim, because again, it is in active development, but you can stay up to date on all the latest news at flightsimulator.com. So let's talk about connecting to ForeFlight. As I mentioned, these three simulators all connect to ForeFlight, and it's actually a very simple process to make this happen. On the one side, we have the simulator. So that's your computer, or your Mac, or your Windows PC running your simulation software. And on the other side, we have your iPad or iPhone running ForeFlight Mobile. In order for your simulator to connect to ForeFlight Mobile, it's required that they be on the same Wi-Fi network. And the same Wi-Fi network is important because the simulator is going to be sending information over to ForeFlight Mobile about what's going on in the simulator, and they need to communicate. And they do that via being on the same Wi-Fi network. So when I say send information, what do I really mean? Well, let's say that you are sitting at home in Michigan, and you're in your flight simulator, but you're flying in the simulator over the Alps. Well, ForeFlight by default would show your GPS position as being in Michigan, right? But we don't want that in this case. We want ForeFlight to feel like it's flying with you in your simulated aircraft over the Alps. And so what the simulator can do once it's connected over the same Wi-Fi network is it can send the simulated GPS position to ForeFlight. And ForeFlight can then use that, and it'll feel like it's in that simulated aircraft with you. But it doesn't just send GPS, it sends other information. For example, AHRS data. So that's the pitch and bank data, the type of information that drives the synthetic vision view in ForeFlight, which we'll get into in a few minutes. It can send other types of miscellaneous data as well. For example, traffic. If you're flying with traffic in the simulator, whether that's AI traffic or like a multiplayer network traffic, it can send those traffic target information to ForeFlight so you can see them on your ForeFlight map. And it sends that data over to ForeFlight, and ForeFlight recognizes it and it displays it appropriately. Now, I want to take a brief moment here just to highlight this part of the connection, the data being sent over. The data that's sent over is sent over in a very specific format. And if you're just a pilot or a simulator enthusiast, you don't have to worry about this format. It's all automatic behind the scenes. It's really plug and play. But for folks who are interested in building their own simulator or experimenting with connectivity to ForeFlight, I wanted to highlight that this information is actually published on our website. It's called the GDL90 specification, and you can see more information on the format that the data is in and how to utilize this data and connect it to ForeFlight at foreflight.com/connect/spec. All right, So let's talk about actually enabling that connection. We mentioned that we need to be on the same Wi-Fi network, that we need to have a simulator, and then ForeFlight on an iPad or an iPhone. We're going to go through the three big simulators, and I'm just going to show you very quickly how easy it is to get these simulators to start pumping out that simulated data so that ForeFlight can use it. We're going to start with Prepared. When you're in Prepared, this is the launch screen where you can configure your flight, set up your flight. There's an Options button at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that Options button, you'll get a new view, and in this view is a checkbox, Broadcast GPS data to network. All you need to do is check that box. And once you've checked it, you can click the OK button, and then all of that GPS data, AHRS data, traffic data will be sent automatically over the network, and ForeFlight can listen to it and then display it on the iPad or iPhone display. For X-Plane, it's a very similar process. So when you open up X-Plane for the first time, there's a Settings button on the main screen, and you can click on that Settings button, and when you do, you'll get a new screen. Lots and lots of different options in here. X-Plane is incredibly configurable. But the option we're looking for is located under the Network tab at the top. If you click on Network, you're going to see this view. And on the right-hand side, there is iPhone, iPad, and external apps. You're going to want to click on that section, and it will expand it. And this is the option we're looking for, Broadcast to all mapping apps on the network. So you want to click that, and then you're going to want to click the Done button. And that's it. And you only have to do this once. For all these simulators, this is a one-time setup. This just tells the simulator, from now on, make sure to broadcast this information because I want to use it with my app. And the last one, Infinite Flight, the mobile flight simulator. This is probably the easiest one to set up. All you need to do is download Infinite Flight from the App Store and go into the Settings menu, which is on the main screen. And once you're there, you're going to want to select Enable ForeFlight Link, and that's it. Then it starts broadcasting that information. Okay, so we've set up our simulators to broadcast our information so that ForeFlight can use it. But we have to do one more thing on the ForeFlight end. We have to tell ForeFlight to actually use this information. When you're looking at ForeFlight Mobile, in the Devices view, which is under the More tab and then the Devices section, if you're not connected to anything, you're going to see a view that looks like this, no devices connected. But as soon as you load up your simulator and you check that box and it starts broadcasting that information, ForeFlight will detect, it can listen to that information. For example, if I had X-Plane broadcasting, I would then see X-Plane listed here automatically. It's all plug and play. If I had Prepared, it would look like this. And each flight sim has its own little tile in this device view. But the one thing that you have to do is tap on that tile. And this is a one-time thing. Tap on that tile. And in this view, there's an Enable button. You want to toggle that on. So what we've done is ForeFlight has told us, hey, I am listening, I hear the simulator. Do you want to actually use this data? And by toggling that on, you're telling ForeFlight, yes, this is the data that I want to use, and I want you to pretend that you're in the simulated aircraft with me. Once you've done that, you'll see the simulated data start to flow into the iPad. So in this case, we have a simulated GPS position. We know that this is a simulated GPS position versus a real one because down in the GPS accuracy section of the instrument panel, you can see we have the simulator name that's sending us this GPS data, in this case, Prepared. And of course, because we're in a simulated environment, we're guaranteed excellent GPS accuracy. So that's a nice perk. All right, so we've set up our simulator to broadcast data. We've set up ForeFlight to listen to that data. Let's fly. Now, Chris, I know that you've been using simulators for a while. You're also a certified flight instructor. What is your philosophy when it comes to flying with simulators generally and things that pilots should make sure to do?
Yeah, I think that some of these simulators could be considered games on a certain level. And one of the bigger purposes why I'm here is to make sure that as pilots, we're approaching simulators with quite a bit of seriousness. And so when we're talking about connecting ForeFlight, what you're going to see here throughout the presentation is that ForeFlight is going to act as though it's getting all the real information. So I would like to, be a conversation piece on emulating the real world and also continuing to build good habits and make sure that we're not, getting off the rails and creating bad habits. So we're going to see a lot of great features now on what ForeFlight can do, how it looks exactly like you would experience in a real plane. And yeah, let's get right into it.
Right on. So in that same vein, you mentioned important to train like we fly, right? And so we want to make sure when we're simulating a flight that we're actually planning that flight out like we would any normal flight in the real world. This helps build practice in that process, but it keeps us honest, right? Like you said, we don't want to build bad habits. So in ForeFlight, one of the primary ways to build a flight and plan a flight is under the Flights tab, which is what we're looking at right here. You can see my airplane. In this case, we're using a Bonanza. It's sitting out on the ramp at our departure airport. And for this particular scenario, we are at Jackson Hole, and we're planning on a simple VFR flight up to Riverton Municipal Airport. So in the flights view, I've entered my departure airport and my destination airport. I've started planning out my flight. So I've entered my aircraft. I've made sure that the performance profile information for this aircraft is accurate. And if I scroll down in this view a little bit, this is where I can go through the rest of my planning process, right? So I can look at my fuel information, make sure I have adequate and legal fuel amounts. I can continue to scroll down and see my weight section, verify all of my weights are within their limits. Once I've planned out the flight, I'm happy with my route and all of my numbers look good. I'm gonna want to get a weather briefing, right? Important to get a briefing before we fly in the real world every time, and we want to do the same thing in the simulator. Now, folks who might be new to simulators or haven't used a simulator in a while might be asking, well, a weather briefing, the weather outside in the real world is going to be different than the simulator. And that is true. However, modern simulators have quite impressive simulations of real world weather. In fact, all of the major simulators now can pull in real world weather. And there's plenty of additional add-ons that flight simulator users can add to make that weather data even more accurate. In this case, I'm going to tap on the briefing button. And when I do that, we can see the ForeFlight graphical briefing. This is the briefing that's been in ForeFlight Mobile for a long time now. And it's all the standard information you'd expect to find on 1-800-weatherbrief.com, but organized in a more iPad-friendly way. So for example, we're looking at adverse conditions section right now. So that includes things like closed and unsafe NOTAMs. We can look at weather charts, surface analysis charts. We can go through the current weather, look at all the latest METARs along our route of flight. We can look at forecast weather under the tasks section. Now this is a short flight. It's only a few minute flight. But for longer flights, this task section is actually a really, really interesting view to look at because ForeFlight is doing your fuel calculations and your time calculations for you. It knows your estimated time en route, right? And it knows what time you're expected to depart. Because of that, as you're flying, ForeFlight knows what your estimated time over each of the waypoints of your route is. And it can look at all of the terminal forecasts along the route and highlight the ones that are expected to be in effect at the time you're flying over. It's a really, really great way to visualize how the forecast data is going to change along your flight as you fly. Lots more information in here. Top-down wind charts, vertical cross-section charts. Important to always check the NOTAMs as well. The NOTAM section divides NOTAMs by departure, destination, alternate, en route, ARTC NOTAMs. Obviously, if there's a specific NOTAM like a closed runway or a VOR is out of service in the real world, that's not going to be the case in the simulator. But we should really try to fly in the simulator as if that was the case. We want to make it as real as possible. Anything you wanted to add?
Ryan, if you mind, if I interject, I think one of the most exciting things about being able to plan like this is obviously one of the biggest decisions we have as a pilot is that go, no go decision, right? That safety decision on whether we should head out the door and to the airplane. You can do all that from home with ForeFlight. And what we're seeing here is that you can plan your flight just as though it is the real world. And then we can go to the simulated airplane, get the actual weather we would face there, and see that whole process actually take place. And I just had a thought of this happening for maybe low time IFR pilots that maybe have their rating, but they're uncomfortable with actual IMC and dealing with a lot of weather. This is a perfect opportunity to practice those sort of things right here. I mean, you're getting the indications on the iPad in ForeFlight, and you can take it to your simulator.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just like the briefing, we can generate a nav log as well, right? So the ForeFlight planning nav log, we tap on that, it'll generate a really, really in-depth nav log with information for all of our legs, winds aloft information, a summary of our fuel and weights. It'll insert top of climb and top of descent based on the aircraft's performance characteristics. It's all built in, which is really handy. All right, so we've planned out our flight. We've looked at the weather. We've gotten a briefing. We're happy with everything, and we're ready to fly in the simulator. So all I need to do is go up into that Send To menu at the top of the screen, and I can select Send To Map. And this takes my flight that I've planned, and it puts it on the map view. So let's do that. So here we are, again, sitting on the ramp at Jackson Hole, and here's my map with my route that I've planned. Now, what I'm going to do next is open up my taxi diagram. And I'm going to go to the plates view and open up that taxi diagram for Jackson Hole. This is a geo-referenced taxi diagram. And we know it's geo-referenced because there's a blue box around a portion of the diagram. And this means I can see my GPS position, or in this case, my simulated GPS position, right on top of that diagram. Super handy feature. You can see here, I've also, before I've even started the aircraft up, I've drawn out what I expect my taxi to be. This is a really useful feature, these annotations. You can annotate lots of different types of documentation in ForeFlight. Chris, when do you use the annotation feature on the taxi diagram?
I use it every time I get a clearance. So obviously, if I'm at my local airport, it's very simple, almost like this taxiway diagram. But imagine being somewhere very complex with a lot of different taxiways. You get a complex readback from air traffic control. I'll actually write down the letters first on the annotations here, and then I'll draw the route. The reason why we're doing all these things is obviously to keep situational awareness and make sure that we're avoiding a runway incursion, which is why we do all of these sorts of exercises on the ground.
Yeah, awesome. Here we are taxiing down, and we can see our GPS position moving as we're making our way to the runway. It's really, really a useful feature of the georeferenced taxi diagrams, is your own ship follows your real position as you're flying. And let's say we pull up to our runway 19er. And this is a view illustrating another really useful feature of ForeFlight. That's something you can test out in the simulator environment, which is runway alerts. So as you approach the runway, ForeFlight will actually tell you that you're approaching and what runway it is. And the moment you cross over that hold short line, ForeFlight will tell you that you've entered that runway and how much distance is remaining between where you are currently located on the runway and the end of the runway. So this is a really great sanity check if you're doing, for example, intersection departures or not intending to do an intersection departure. It's a really great way to have a quick sanity check on how much distance is remaining. Chris, have you found these alerts useful in the training environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a famous accident actually where an aircraft pulled onto a runway and took off on the wrong runway. So these are some of the tools that we're using as pilots now, just to double check ourselves, make sure we're on the right runway. And it's very, very helpful because obviously we don't want to repeat any bad situations. But these airports can be complex, and sometimes as pilots, we're moving pretty quickly from here to there, and we're busy, and it's pretty easy to get confused. So this is, again, one of those places you do not want to get confused, and I really appreciate these sorts of safety features. It really helps us in the training level with students all the way up to professional pilots that are flying multiple legs a day.
Yeah. Of course, there are multiple different types of alerts in ForeFlight. Runway alerts are just one type. And the simulator environment is a great way to actually test out these alerts, see what they look like and when they're triggered, and kind of play with them a little bit in a controlled environment. And you can configure all the different types of alerts in ForeFlight under the settings view. So if you go to the More tab at the bottom of the screen and go to the settings section, which is on the left-hand side, there is a alerts. If you scroll down in this view, there's an alert section. And if you tap on this, you can see all the different types of alerts that are available. So ForeFlight can do things like give you sync rate alerts. It can tell you the runway that you're lined up on final approach. It can give you transition altitude alerts. It can tell you what the destination weather frequency is as you're approaching your destination. But there's one alert in particular that I want to highlight here. That's the terrain and obstacle alerts. This is the only alert type that's off by default. So if you want ForeFlight to alert you to potential terrain and obstacles ahead as you're flying, you'll want to come into this view and turn this one on. The other thing I want to highlight here is the Speak All Alerts action. This, when enabled, will actually speak these alerts directly into your headset. So if you're flying in the real world in an airplane, you can connect a Bluetooth headset to your iPad and you can hear these alerts. If you're flying in a simulated environment, you can connect your Bluetooth at-home headphones to your iPad and you'll hear them in exactly the same way. But the audio alerts are really great, right? Because you can have your head out the window working on navigation or flying. And if an alert pops up, you won't miss it because you don't have to look down at your screen to get it. You can hear it right in your headset. Really handy. Okay, so let's say we've pulled onto the runway, we've departed Jackson Hole, and we are now en route to our destination. So here we are, we're climbing. And in this case, I have made the intentional decision to fly into an area of terrain here, again, in the simulated environment. And I'm doing this because I wanted to show what one of these alerts looks like, that terrain and obstacle alert. So here we are flying, and you can see the hazard alerts box pops open on my screen. It highlights that terrain. I can tap the full screen button, and ForeFlight enables what we call the hazard advisor, which gives me a track up orientation and color codes all of the hazardous terrain around me. And I can make my a change in my direction based on that information that I'm seeing there. Now, obviously, you know, we're flying in day VFR in the simulator right now, so it's quite clear that we're coming up on a mountain. But you can imagine cases in IMC at night or at night when such an alert might be useful. This alerting technology in ForeFlight, the little box that pops up that warns you, what it's doing is it's generating a 3D trajectory of your flight path, and it's cross-referencing that 3D trajectory with the worldwide Jeppesen terrain and obstacle database that's built into every ForeFlight subscription. And whenever it notices that there's a potential conflict with your trajectory and that terrain or obstacle database, it's going to alert you. And again, that's a feature that's off by default, but you can turn it on and you can simulate how that would display in the simulator. It's a really, really great example of the power of simulators, trying out new features like this. I want to mention, you know, we turned on that hazard advisor from the terrain and obstacle alerts, but you can actually have that terrain, that yellow and red terrain view, which we call hazard advisor, you can have that on all the time. And you can do that by going into the layer selector up at the top of the screen and then selecting hazard advisor. And when you do this, you're going to see that terrain color coded yellow or red based on its threat level as you fly. And you'll see the terrain colors morph and change as you climb or descend. It's all based on your GPS altitude, or in the simulator, your simulated altitude.
And Ryan,
yeah,
I was going to jump in here because actually I fly around mountains quite a bit. I'm an instructor in Alaska. When I'm not instructing, I'm enjoying flying around the mountains. And we actually have quite a high accident rate here in Alaska for controlled flight into terrain or CFIT. And tools like this, where you can see the terrain, you know where it is, you have the hazard advisor that pops up. We're even going to see here in a few minutes the synthetic vision and how that looks. All these tools kind of brought together just help out in situations where the weather might be deteriorating and you're getting caught in a bad situation, or like you said, flying at night where it's pitch black outside, you're technically VFR, but you can't see. These are all tools that are just so helpful for not only flying like you're actively flying right now, but planning. And we'll see some of that in the profile view as well. So if you're a flatlander pilot out there, you've never flown in the mountains before, you wouldn't usually use these sorts of tools. This is how a simulator could be really helpful, because you could go to theoretically any airport in the world in the mountains and try this sort of tool out and get the correct indications with that worldwide database from Jeppesen on ForeFlight.
Yeah, well said. And I just want to highlight again that these alerts, they're not just for terrain, they're for obstacles as well. So, you know, I fly in the Chicago area, fixed wing, but I've been working on my rotorcraft and, you know, lower level, and obstacles are a big deal, especially for everyone, but particularly for helicopters. And so that extra awareness where ForeFlight's constantly monitoring for you can be really handy.
Yeah, lots of towers these days.
Yeah. Wanted to show off another feature related to terrain, which is the ForeFlight synthetic vision. So the simulator, as we mentioned, it sends the AHRS data, the pitch and bank data, just like it sends over the GPS data. And so you can see here as I'm banking over the Jackson Hole area, we're getting similar depiction in synthetic vision. You can see it color codes that terrain the same way that we color code it for the hazard visor. So I have a 3D view here on the left in synthetic vision. I have a 2D top-down view on the right with hazard visor, which is really, really handy.
And Ryan, I just want to mention really quick that the webinar viewers are going to see this kind of choppy. That's just a limitation of the webinar technology. When you actually see this in the simulator, it'll be really smooth. When you see it depicted on the iPad, it'll be really smooth as well.
Yeah, well said. It's buttery smooth in real life.
Right.
What we were showing there was the synthetic vision view is interactive. So I can tap on it, I can move around, view different airports, runways, things like that. In addition to showing terrain and obstacles in 3D, it can also show traffic in 3D. So here's an example flying along, and we see some traffic targets on the top-down map on the bottom of the screen, as well as in synthetic vision up at the top. And I can zoom in and I can tap on those traffic targets and inspect them. And this is a really great way to get an idea of where the traffic is relative to where your aircraft is pointing. Now, the question might come up, in a simulated environment, well, what kind of traffic am I going to see? I'm flying by myself on my simulator. And although that's true, all of the major simulators have simulated traffic. So they can basically generate randomized AI aircraft that fly around on predefined routes. And this is configurable in the settings for each individual simulator. But beyond that, there are actually even more options for traffic. For example, there is a worldwide flight simulation network called VATSIM, which is simulator pilots and simulator controllers. And when you connect to VATSIM, that traffic flows into your simulator, and then you would see it in ForeFlight. But there's actually a new service. It's been out for a little while now, but it's really changed the game for traffic, but also just general flight simulation realism. It's called Pilot Edge. And Pilot Edge is a service that allows you to sign up and fly in the closest thing to a real-world airspace system that is available right now. So Pilot Edge is a service that you connect to, and you communicate just as you would in the real world with controllers. They're simulated controllers, but they're professionally trained. It's an incredibly professional environment. And Pilot Edge is a great way to not just simulate flying with other aircraft in your airspace, but also practice your radio communication in a simulated environment. Chris, I know you've used Pilot Edge. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you explained it really well in that imagine loading up at an airport, like say Jackson Hole, and actually that Pilot Edge has a specific geographic area they work in so that they can guarantee the service. So Southern California is one of those areas. Imagine loading up at an airport there. You look at the airport frequencies within ForeFlight, find out which ground frequency you need to call. You dial in that frequency, call it, you get a controller. So it's very professional that way. They use the correct phraseology and you use it back. They'll even help with the training a little bit, tell you how you should say the radio call, especially if you're training. So very, very helpful. And the point with simulators is if you can find moments where you forget that you're flying the simulator and you feel like it's real and it's stressful, and you have the radio calls along with that, then you are really achieving some fantastic realism, some great learning, some proficiency, all of those things. And Pilot Edge just takes that to a whole different level by adding that communication layer.
Yeah, it's a really great service. So for folks who are listening and are interested in improving their radio communication or just keeping it as realistic as possible, definitely check out Pilot Edge, pilotedge.net. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is diversions. So when we are working on diversions in a simulated environment, ForeFlight has a variety of different features that can help. Chris, do you see diversions on my screen right now?
I do. Yep.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about diversions then a little bit. So the 5 C's, right? Something that most pilots have heard, but important to keep in mind. You want to walk through these a little bit, Chris?
Yeah, so you don't necessarily have to write these down or anything, but the 5 C's are your way of getting out of a situation, communicating with people, conserving your fuel, finding out where to go, how long it's going to get there, how much fuel it's going to take to get there. And we're going to show you some tools now that can help you accomplish the 5 C's. I remember doing this in my training and feeling like I was in the middle of nowhere. I didn't have tools to help me. But with something like ForeFlight, now we know who to call. We can use the ruler tool to see how long it'll take to get there, how much fuel, et cetera. So it really actually gives you a bit of a co-pilot, if you will, to help you out of a situation where you need to either get out of a lost situation or divert because you need to make a safe decision and get on the ground, essentially.
Yeah. So let's take a look at some of the features that that folks can practice with in a simulated environment to improve their diversions. One of those features is the nearby airport instrument. So when you're looking at ForeFlight Mobile, up at the top, there's this button here. It looks like a little dashboard dial, and you can tap on that and you get this bar at the bottom. We call this the instrument panel. I think one thing that a lot of users may not even be aware of is the fact that there's a lot of really useful information here, obviously, but you can change the types of information that are depicted in each of these slots along the bottom. So for example, I can tap on that ground speed option there, which is 3 from the left. And if I tap on that, I get a list. And this is all the things, the additional things that I could show in place of ground speed in that location. And the one I think that's super relevant to diversions, if I scroll down in this list, is the nearest airport option. So if I select that, it's going to put the nearest airport in that slot. So I get the airport identifier, a direction, and a distance to that nearest airport, which is super handy. And that'll update as you fly. That'll always updating it, as well as the rest of the instruments there. They're constantly up to date. Let's say we're flying to our destination and we decide we need to divert. We want to divert to this airport here. Well, the first thing I can do is I can take 2 fingers and I can put them down on the map. And when I do that, we get what's called the ruler. So the ruler is going to show you not just the distance between the left side of the ruler and the right side of the ruler, in this case, our own ship position and our possible diversion airport. But it's also going to show us the amount of time based on our current GPS ground speed it would take to fly that, and how much fuel we would burn based on our aircraft's fuel performance to get there. So a lot of really critical information in one simple view right there.
Yeah, I think this is one of my absolute favorite tools when it comes to these diversions or even an emergency situation where you need to get back somewhere. Because really, you could quickly use this ruler and look at multiple airports, see how long it's going to take, see what your best option is, and then execute. And then you're going to show how to go direct, essentially, to Dubuque here.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to bring up real quickly related to the ruler is we have a profile view in ForeFlight, and that shows your terrain, obstacles, and airspace along your route or ahead of your aircraft. But when you put the ruler down, it's now measuring the terrain, obstacles, and airspace along the actual ruler, which is really great because if you're trying to measure, what altitude you need to be to divert off course, you can just put the ruler down where you want to go, open up the profile, and it's in ruler mode, so it's going to show you all the things that are on the ground along that route where the ruler is. And you can take your finger and you can actually place it on the profile itself, and you'll get a little dot, and you'll notice a corresponding dot on the map. So that's a great way to correlate whatever you're clicking on in the profile with where that is actually located on the top-down map as well.
And imagine doing something like that at night in this area where you had terrain and you need to quickly get somewhere just at a glance and know that you're going to be clear. It's very, very helpful.
So let's say we wanted to divert to this airport. So I'll tap on it and we get the standard airport information. And in one tap, I can go direct to. I'll just tap that direct to button. And now we have a route planned from our own ship position to that airport. Now, of course, one of the other C's in the 5 C's is communicate. And there's a lot of different ways to pull up communication information in ForeFlight when you need to contact air traffic control. One of them is, you'll notice these little, what we call stamps all over the map. These show the nearest air traffic control center frequency for the area you're flying in. And you can actually, like most things in ForeFlight, you can tap on this. And you can get a lot of information about the center and what their high altitude and low altitude frequencies are. Is this something you've used before, Chris?
I use it all the time. I love this feature because it's not depicted anywhere on the sectional charts. And even if you go to the airport information, that's unreliable as well. So yeah, I use this all the time.
Cool. Another feature that I think is a great one to simulate, and we'll walk through a scenario now on how to do that, is what we call Glide Advisor. So here's a scenario. I am flying off the coast of Northern California. Glide Advisor is a feature that actually paints out your available gliding distance based on a couple things, your GPS altitude, your aircraft's glide performance, best glide speed and ratio, but it also takes into account the current winds aloft forecast information, as well as that terrain and obstacle database. I'll show you what it looks like. You can open up the settings menu on the map up at the top. When you do that, you get a menu with a lot of options, but if you scroll down a little bit, there's this option, Glide Advisor. And when you turn that on, you're gonna see a couple of things happen. The first is you get this green blob on the screen. That is the actual real-time depiction of your available gliding distance based on the winds aloft forecast, your aircraft's GPS altitude, and any terrain. So you can see our gliding range is cut off quite a bit on the right-hand side there. And the reason for that is that terrain slopes up quite steeply once you get past the shoreline in this area of Northern California, and you wouldn't be able to glide beyond that distance because of terrain. The other thing that shows up on the screen when you turn on Glide Advisor is just an indication of the aircraft glide performance data that is being used to actually draw out this green circle. And you can tap on this and you can double check the best glide speed and glide ratio are entered for the aircraft. And you can set this up for all the different aircraft that you fly. And whenever you enable Glide Advisor, when you're flying with that aircraft, it'll show the correct information. But I wanted to highlight this because it's super important. It's a critical piece of information for Glide Advisor to work correctly. So let's take a look at a simulated scenario in which we can see how Glide Advisor works. So again, here we are off the coast of Northern California. We're flying along. You can see our Glide Advisor. It is following our aircraft position as we're flying. But notice what happens when I begin a pretty steep descent here. You'll notice that Glide Advisor begin to shrink drastically on the map. And that's because as our altitude decreases, obviously our available gliding distance is decreasing as well. As I begin to level out along the shoreline, you can see that our Glide Advisor now stabilizes. It's about the same size. And if I begin a climb again, we can see that the Glide Advisor now begins to expand. As we've gained altitudes, we have more available gliding distance. Chris, what are some examples of times you use Glide Advisor?
I live on the coast in Alaska, and I use it all the time. I'm constantly harping on my students and even people I teach online that you need to be very cognizant of flying over open water. You know, as a single engine pilot, you've got one option. You got one engine. So if you were to have an issue, it's always good to have an out. Not only does it work for water, where you need to make sure that you can make certain water crossings, which is typically what I do, right? I'm using Glide Advisor to see those water crossings and even use the ruler along with it. But it can also work very well in the mountains. So you can see where you can glide through the terrain, for example. It also will give you a quick look at your ability to make an airport within that glide ring. You can see here in this particular screenshot that Arcata looks like we can barely make it. Like it's an option. So those are the sorts of things I'm thinking about when I'm using Glide Advisor. For me, because I'm on the coast and I fly in the mountains, I have it on all the time. And I have dialed in my glide ratio for my particular airplane. And then beyond that, trying this out in the simulator, because I don't think I would try this out over water in my airplane to see if it really worked, right? But to try this out in the simulator is a great example of how you could use a simulator for some emergency training or practice, especially while you're running checklists and doing everything else that keeps you busy, and just see how quickly everything happens, so that if that were to come up sometime, here you go. You have the tools, you have the training, you have the practice.
Yeah, this is such a great example of where simulators can really shine, right? Like as you mentioned, that airport is just on the edge of that Glide Advisor right now. One thing you can obviously do in the simulator is try it, right? Cut the engine and see if you can make it at best glide speed, right?
Yep, absolutely.
These are scenarios that are really, really useful to try in the simulated environment. I want to talk a little bit about approach now, right? So we talked about planning the flight, departing the airport, a few features that are useful en route and for diversions. I want to talk about approach now as well. In ForeFlight, we have a couple different ways to pull up procedures. In this example, I have a flight plan from Phoenix to Palm Springs. And I'm going to go to the plates view and I'm going to pull up a procedure into Palm Springs. This is the RNAV Zulu for runway 13 right. I chose this one. It's one of my favorites, actually. I just think it's a really fun looking approach, challenging as well. And I wanted to highlight a few things on the actual approach plate that are of note. The first is up at the top, you can see this red button, tap to view one NOTAM. This is a feature we call NOTAMs on plates. When I tap on this, it's going to show me all of the NOTAMs that have been published that are relevant to the specific procedure that I am looking at. The idea here is, the FAA publishes tons and tons and tons of NOTAMs all day, every day. And it's important to review the full extent of all these NOTAMs that are relevant to your flight before you fly. But just as an extra level of situational awareness, ForeFlight parses through all of those NOTAMs, and the ones that it recognizes that are relevant to a specific procedure, it's going to put them right on the procedure, so draw your attention to it. The other aspect of procedures that's really useful is you can annotate them. Just like we were annotating our taxi diagram on the ground, we can annotate our procedure and mark it up with notes. And I can do that using the pencil button at the top of the screen. When I tap the pencil, I can add a variety of different notes with my finger or with a stylus. How do you normally go about this, Chris? When are you annotating, and what's important to you for annotating procedures?
Yeah, I mean, you've highlighted a couple things here. I would highlight too. I'm always concerned about my my DH and MDA and the step downs and my course and certain frequencies. I usually brief it all that way and then highlight the things that are super important. And obviously, as an IFR pilot using a chart like this, you are doing that work ahead of time. So you're familiarizing yourself. You're helping yourself, your future self, when you're actually going to be on the approach. So I love the annotation tools. I also go a step further. I organize my charts in the plates view so that I can bring them up quickly for the airport I'm flying into. So a handful of different ways to do that. But yeah, annotations are I use them all the time.
Yeah, same. Super handy feature. And it's worth noting for folks who are flying with a stylus like an Apple Pencil, ForeFlight works out of the box with that as well. So if you prefer to actually make these annotations with something a little bit closer to a pen, that's fully supported as well. Of course, the whole idea here, briefing the approach, making annotations on important things, is to familiarize ourselves with the approach, right? There's a lot of other ways to visualize the approach in ForeFlight to become more familiar with it. One way to do that is by using this tool up in the top right of the flight plan drawer, where it says procedure. We call this procedure advisor. It's an incredibly powerful tool. When I tap on procedure, this allows me to select and visualize departures, arrivals, approaches, and even traffic patterns into and out of any airport in the world. So for example, if we were going to fly this RNAV into Palm Springs and I wanted to use procedure advisor to visualize it, I could tap on approaches into Palm Springs. I could select the approach that I want. In this case, ForeFlight's telling me the runway that the winds are favoring. In this case, it's the approach I want, 13 right. And when I tap on that, I get a visualization of that approach and all of the initial approach fixes. And I can select the initial approach fix that I intend to fly, and I get a preview. So I get my base map, I get my actual plate, my georeferenced plate, and then on top of that, I get all of my waypoints. And if I'm happy with this depiction, this is what I want to fly, then I can tap the Add to Route button. And this is where the magic happens. So when I tap Add to Route, it takes all that information and it stacks it, it overlays it all in one view. And this is where the power of ForeFlight really shines. You can customize and stack information how you want for better situational awareness. Up in the flight plan drawer, if I open that up, you can see here that it's added that procedure to my actual route of flight. So this is a great way to get a visualization of all the waypoints, including restrictions like speed and altitude restrictions for a given approach on the map. But another new feature that's available to Performance Plus customers is 3D preview. So this is a way to actually preview the approach, not just from the top down, but in 3D. You can do this by tapping the 3D button in the flight plan drawer, and it will visualize your entire route, including any procedures you've added in 3D. So here we're looking at 3D preview for this RNAV approach. I can take my finger and I can tap and zoom around. I can see all the waypoints for the approach, all of the restrictions. I'm in a third person mode right now, so I see my airplane from the third person, but I can scrub through it and move back and forth, see what kind of terrain I'm going to be flying over for this approach. I can tap the first person button in the bottom left, and now I have a first person view of what this approach is going to look like. So really incredibly powerful feature. Is this a feature you've used in your flight training, Chris?
Well, it's pretty new, so actually I haven't been able to use it yet. But man, I really wish I would have had this when I went through my training, because part of the difficulty for an IFR student is to be able to take the 2D data that we see on a chart, where we see the profile view and we see the top-down map view, and be able to interpolate it into something that's 3D. But we usually do that in our minds, right? Well, here we are. Like, we just dialed in the approach. And now we can visualize it before we actually fly it. And that's going to be hugely helpful for people to get over that hump.
Right. Yeah. Super exciting feature. And like most things in ForeFlight, we got a lot of cool plans for the future. So stay tuned for more things related to this. Another thing I wanted to bring up is, we've talked about IFR approaches, but obviously if we're flying VFR into an airport, we're going to be wanting to visualize and plan out our traffic pattern entry for this airport. A really quick and easy way to do this in ForeFlight is by using map annotations. So at the bottom of the screen, I have a pencil button. I can actually annotate directly on top of the map, just like I annotated on a taxi diagram or on an approach plate. So when I tap that pencil button, I can take my finger or a stylus and I can draw anything I want anywhere on the map. And a traffic pattern entry is a great example of something like that. So here, just drawing out a 45 entry to the left downwind for this runway. But you can draw anything you want, make notes. One thing that I do when I'm flying is I make a bunch of notes about my VFR waypoints, just circle them on the map, make little notes about things I should be looking for. You can very quickly write down frequencies, weather information, that sort of thing. Do you use map annotations much when you fly, Chris?
Yeah, whenever a new feature is released with ForeFlight, I always take a step back and I ask myself, how can my students succeed with this new feature? How can this help them? And when people are learning to fly, they have difficulty just knowing how to enter the pattern and which way to go and which way to turn, etc. I know it sounds simple, but we've all been there when we started flying.
Sure.
And a tool like this, where you can think outside the box a little bit, how do we actually use that to help someone? Yeah, it's amazing. And I like your idea of using it for VFR waypoints, because that brings back the pencil, right? That we all used to use on an actual map. Now we have it again right here in ForeFlight, and we can just mark it up all we want, except this time we can erase it right away and not have to keep everything there. But very cool.
Well, yeah, and one of my favorite parts about using this feature, especially in flight, is you don't actually, if you have an Apple Pencil, you don't actually have to even tap that pencil button in the bottom left to start annotating. The Apple
Mm,
Pencil communicates with the iPad. So as soon as you put that pencil down on the screen, it knows it's an Apple Pencil, not your finger. And so it starts annotating for you automatically. And then you can pan around with your finger and then start annotating again. It's like the closest thing to actual paper and pencil in the digital space. It's really cool.
right.
I wanted to highlight really quickly, just before we move on, that in addition to drawing out your traffic patterns manually, like annotating them, you can actually do that through Procedure Advisor as well. So if you're a VFR pilot, Procedure Advisor is still valuable. You can go into Procedure Advisor and you can select traffic patterns. And ForeFlight will show you all the different traffic pattern entries for each runway, left traffic or right traffic. It'll highlight the ones that are the recommended side, and you can select that. And when you do that, you can add it to your route, and then it draws out that pattern entry for you. So obviously not something you're not going to want to following this pattern
Right.
entry line as you're actually entering the pattern, but really, really good just to get some situational awareness prior to being in the terminal environment.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that, because you do need to be eyes out at this point, obviously. But yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely great for knowing where you're going to turn again, as a different option from annotations.
yeah. So let's fly an approach in the sim. Let's fly that RNAV. So here we are. We've flown most of the approach and we're turning final now. You can see a couple different things here. Again, this is into Palm Springs. We can see synthetic vision. I've opened that up and I have it side by side with my approach plate, and I have all my waypoints and restrictions added through Procedure Advisor. We can see the windmills depicted in synthetic vision, just as they're depicted in the simulator. We can also see the airport as we turn final here. We can see the runway rendered out in synthetic vision, the little airport identifier in synthetic vision. We can see our accurate pitch and bank as well in SV as we're flying. What do you think about using synthetic vision in the approach phase, Chris?
Imagine if all of your electronics went out all of a sudden and you're flying at night and you're in IMC and you have that tool right there. I know that's kind of extreme situation, not that that's really going to happen, but I think it's fantastic for situational awareness. I mean, I also think of using a simulator not with the real world. We know that Palm Springs, it's going to be sunny usually, but what about loading up actual IMC weather and being able to shoot this approach in IMC weather? And you can set the minimums, like set the layer right at minimums, so you know what it's like to break out and transition to landing. So yes, these tools are just very cool. And IFR is where simulators really shine. So
Yeah,
if you're an IFR pilot or learning to be or want to be, these are incredible tools to learn how to be a very proficient IFR pilot with a tool like ForeFlight. So yeah, definitely recommended.
Awesome. And yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate here that these tools we're talking about, the synthetic vision view, even just the GPS position in ForeFlight, when it comes to real world flying, these are not approved for primary navigation use, right? These are
Right.
supplementary
Right.
only. So they're really there
Mhm.
just to aid your situational awareness. And it's important to always rely on your aircraft's avionics and navigation capabilities, because that's the certified and legal way to navigate.
Right. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to show here was here we are. We're on short final. We're touching down at Palm Springs. And as I touch down on the Bonanza, you're going to see my iPad is actually going to switch automatically to show the taxi diagram. This is a feature. We call it Auto Show Taxi. Based on your GPS altitude, once it reaches field elevation at an airport and your GPS ground speed slows beneath 40 knots, ForeFlight automatically shows you the taxi diagram for that airport with your position on top of it. It's not anything that you have to do manually. It's a feature that you can enable or disable under settings. And it doesn't matter if this airport is in your route or not. It's always going to pull up the taxi diagram for the airport that you've arrived at. So really, really handy. So saves you one tap, basically.
Yeah, and we've come full circle from the original runway incursion stuff we were working on in Jackson, and
Yeah.
now we're working on it again. So those tools are just really helpful. You could pull off the runway on the taxiway, call the tower, do your annotations again, and be taxiing to the ramp.
Yeah. So let's talk about post-flight a little bit. So we've flown a flight in the simulator, and now we want to maybe review it. And ForeFlight has a bunch of great tools for reviewing your flight after you've flown. One of them is called the track log. So ForeFlight can record your flight, whether it's your simulated flight or a real world flight. It can record it in real time, and it allows you to play through it and see your position on the map, as well as graph out things like altitude, ground speed, and pitch and bank as well if you have an AR source through the simulator or in the real world connected. This track log view is super, super handy for reviewing maneuvers, how you've done maneuvers. This is actually one of my track logs. This is from a flight that I made in a helicopter, actually, which is why the data might look a little funky to the fixed wing pilots. But it's something I use all the time. After every flight, I love to review and see how I did. And the fact that it's built into ForeFlight and the fact that the data is recorded automatically for me just makes it so much easier. Is this something you use in the training environment, Chris?
Yeah, the debrief is obviously a very important part of training. So maneuvers are a great way to see that. I think when you're doing like VFR maneuvers, it can look a little wonky and you're not sometimes sure what you're looking at. But IFR, really helpful. You can see where you flew, if you're on track, if you were, doing S turns back and forth on the final approach, or if you're right on the final approach. So that's where I think it really shines, is seeing it there and how well you're stepping down, because everything should be really smooth and precise in instrument. So yeah, I think debriefing is something we need to do more of. I know that you guys at ForeFlight have been bringing those tools on board. So I just encourage people out there that already have ForeFlight or are getting it to start to dive into these tools and start to be a little bit more critical about yourself so you can grow.
Yeah. In addition to the actual 2D track log review here, which is great to see maneuvers and different pieces of information, you can tap the 3D button on the track log view, and you can actually replay the flight in 3D as well. So this is an approach into Aspen, actually, and this is rendered in real time based on my GPS position and altitude. And that's just kind of a really interesting way to refly the flight at various speeds and see that terrain that I was flying over.
That's so cool.
So this brings up kind of the obvious next question, Chris, which I think is a super important one for us to touch on, which is, can I log it? You've flown the flight in the simulator. If you've flown it realistically, maybe it's challenged you, which is a good thing. And I think we get a lot of questions from folks about what is loggable, what isn't. What is your direction on that one, Chris?
Yeah, it's not loggable. If you have a home simulator, it's not loggable. You're going to be using a professional level simulator with your flight school that's either a BATD or an AATD. You can log hours for that, 10 hours and 20 hours respectively toward your IFR. And then you can do it for recurrent training as well to make sure that you're keeping up on that IFR currency. So yeah, even though you can't log it, I think we need to take a step back from the logging and ask, is it valuable? Is
Right.
this valuable as a proficiency tool for you at home, even outside of the approved simulator? Because we know that if you have practice doing it and going through the motions and say even use Pilot Edge and doing everything like you should be doing, it is hugely helpful, even if you can't log it.
Yeah. Great. Well, that concludes our webinar today on flight simulation and ForeFlight. We have plenty of time. Chris and I are going to stick around for folks who have submitted questions during the webinar. My colleague Sam has been collecting those questions. Sam, we get any good questions in?
Hey, yeah, we got a ton of questions actually, and I want to go ahead and say for everyone who has not had their question answered, sorry about that. It's just not possible. There's way too many questions coming in to get every single question answered. We're going to read out several of them here over the next 15 or 20 minutes. But if at the end of this your question has not been answered, please, you can email us at team@foreflight.com. Our pilot support team can answer any question you throw at them, so feel free to do that. You can also DM us on Twitter or other social media platforms, and we can try to respond to your question that way as well. So, kicking it off, let's go ahead and start with this one. There were some questions about how the ForeFlight to simulator connection works with Wi-Fi. So this question is, does it have to be over Wi-Fi? My sim is hardwired to my network with my iPad on the Wi-Fi network. So would that work rather than having both of them connected via Wi-Fi?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is yes. So I did say Wi-Fi network. What I meant really was network period. So for example, if your computer is hardwired into a network switch and that network switch is connected over the LAN to your actual Wi-Fi, it's all operating on the same network, then yes, that will work just fine. In fact, that's how I run my simulator. I have a hardwired connection into my simulation PC, which is connected into a switch, which goes to a router. But it's all technically connected on the same network. It's just the iPad connects via Wi-Fi and the computer connects via the hardwire connection. So as long as they're on the same network connection, they can communicate.
Right. So there were also a number of questions concerning what data gets shared back and forth between the simulator and ForeFlight. And so one was specifically about is weather shared either from the simulator to ForeFlight or from ForeFlight to the simulator?
Great question. The only information that is shared from the simulator to ForeFlight is the GPS location information, the AHRS data, so pitch and bank information, and traffic data, which some simulators will send over. That's the extent of it. So unfortunately, if the simulator is depicting weather in a certain way, maybe it's depicting a certain thunderstorm cell in a given area, you will not see that exact depiction within ForeFlight Mobile. If you were to open up the weather layer in ForeFlight, you would see the real world depiction of that weather. Now, that being said, like I mentioned, a lot of simulators have gotten much better at real world depictions of weather. And that's one of the areas that the new Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 has been focusing a lot of their development on. And so just because the simulator weather is not sent to the iPad, the better these simulators get at depicting real world weather, the better it's going to match. And to answer the second part of the question, ForeFlight itself does not send any information back to the simulator. So it's receiving that data only from the sim.
And that's why I think doing the real world weather and the real world flight planning and everything is again, where things really shine. If you're an IFR pilot stuck on the ground and you want to fly the real bad IFR weather, then go fly it in your sim. Like it's definitely doable, but it won't go the other direction because ForeFlight is pulling in the real data from the real world sources from the FAA and elsewhere.
All right, next question, and we got a fair number of these questions also. What iPad do you recommend to use with ForeFlight?
So it's a great question. When people ask what iPad, they're really asking a couple different questions there. They're asking what screen size of iPad, right? Like what physical size. They're asking what storage size, what amount of built-in storage should I get? And they're also asking what capabilities, because different iPads, some are GPS only and some are GPS plus cellular connection. If you're planning on flying in the real world with ForeFlight, what I would recommend is getting a cellular model iPad. And the reason I recommend that is because the cellular model iPad is the only version that comes with a built-in GPS. The Wi-Fi only models, unfortunately, don't have a built-in GPS. Now, if you are flying only in a simulator environment, you do not intend to use ForeFlight in real-world aviation, then you're getting a GPS source from the simulator, right? So your Wi-Fi only iPad would still work in the simulated environment. But for real world, definitely get the cellular model. Every iPad comes in Wi-Fi only or cellular. Now, in terms of storage size, we recommend a minimum of the 32 gigabyte internal storage size. And the reason we recommend that is you can download pretty much all the information ForeFlight offers, all of our chart data, weather data, flight planning information for pretty much the whole world, and it'll all fit on the 32 gigabyte size. Now, if you're going to be using your iPad for other things, for example, if you're putting infinite flight on your iPad, right, that takes up storage. If you're using your iPad for videos and photos, that takes up storage. And so if you're going to be using it for other things beyond that, maybe consider bumping that storage size up to 64 or 128. And then the third one, which is arguably one of the most important considerations, is the screen size, right? So the iPad comes in multiple screen sizes, the iPad mini on the smallest size, the iPad Air, and the iPad Pro, which comes in 2 sizes. It really depends on what you fly. So for me, I've been flying in the R44, and I use an iPad mini with a suction cup mount on the side, because anything bigger than that would kind of be cumbersome in that environment. If you have more room in the cockpit, you can consider going up to the iPad Air. I will say the iPad Air is the most popular iPad that our customers choose to use, but the iPad mini is very popular as well. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I used a mini as well, just because I'm typically in a 172 doing flight training, and anything bigger than that is just a little too cumbersome for me. So I used a mini. I take along a Sentry with me or connect directly to a panel, but the Sentry allows me to be in any airplane with the AHRS information and ADSB information. So it just depends. Different strokes for different folks.
So so to summarize, Sam, I would say if you're flying real world, get the cellular model. You don't have to sign up for cellular data service, but you do need that for the GPS. Get a minimum 32 gigabyte size, and then for the screen size itself, it's up to what you're flying and what you're comfortable with. Go to an Apple store or a Best Buy, look at the different sizes, put them in your hand, feel them, and see what size you think is going to work for you.
Yeah, and I just want to also point out that all of that information that Ryan just shared is available on our website. If you go to foreflight.com/buying-guide, that has all of the same sort of information, and also some other information about devices you can use with iPads and things. So definitely check that out if you want to see that on a web page. Next up, we have, will ForeFlight also cover European charts for a sim?
Yeah, so ForeFlight expanded into Europe last year, and we have a variety of different European chart providers that are available in the application, or you can opt for Jeppesen chart coverage, which covers Europe as well. And all of the chart coverages that are available through ForeFlight will work with your simulator. So there is no distinction between chart coverage or subscription level and simulator connection. So ForeFlight, everything that's in ForeFlight will work with a simulator, regardless of whether it's real world or whether it's simulated. If you're interested in what sort of European chart coverages ForeFlight has, you can check out that information on our website. I believe the short URL is foreflight.com/Europe. Is that correct, Sam?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, so you can check out the different European chart coverages we have there. You can also see information on the Jeppesen chart coverages, but that will all work totally fine, just like with the rest of the features in ForeFlight when connected to a simulator.
So this next one is was sort of already answered by you, but I think it helps to answer it again for this particular specific question. Does ForeFlight load the performance, fuel burn, etc. of the chosen airplane that you were using in the program?
Yeah, great question. So ForeFlight has a couple different subscription levels: Basic Plus, Pro Plus, and Performance Plus. And each of those subscription levels has different features. Basic Plus and Pro Plus, they allow you, the user, to input the aircraft's performance information. So you can go into the aircraft view in ForeFlight and you can tell ForeFlight what type of aircraft it is, how fast it flies in climb, cruise, and descent, and how much fuel it's going to burn in climb, cruise, and descent. For Performance Plus customers, which is the top tier subscription, we have far more accurate performance profiles that are actually sourced directly from the aircraft manufacturers, and that's built into the app. So as soon as you enter the tail number and type code of the aircraft you're flying, it's going to actually pull in the performance profiles, the stuff you'd expect to see in the performance section of the POH. That's built in. So ForeFlight can actually pre-fill that information for you, saves you a lot of time. These performance profiles are actually a lot more accurate than just entering single numbers for climb, cruise, and descent speeds and burns, because they take into account your weight change as you're burning fuel during your flight, and they also take into account temperature changes as you climb or descend in altitude, and how that affects the aircraft performance. So those are built in for ForeFlight Performance Plus customers, but all customers can enter their own fuel burn and speed information in the aircraft section of the application, and ForeFlight will then use that data to give you accurate numbers.
Yeah, so sort of in the vein of that question, there were a number of other questions concerning what features are available with what subscription levels, and specifically some of the terrain warning and hazard advisor features. Are those only available in the Pro subscription? So Ryan, if you can maybe quickly just go over how some of the features you demonstrated in this webinar break down into each of the plan levels.
Sure. So all of the charts we're looking at, like the taxi diagrams and the approach plates, those are all standard features that are available in all three of our subscription levels. When you step up to the Pro Plus level, what happens is you get a couple additional features. The first is you get geo-referenced approach plates and taxi diagrams. So that's what allows us to see our GPS position on top of that taxi diagram or on top of that approach plate. That you need the Pro Plus subscription to be able to do that. You also need the Pro Plus subscription to be able to take that procedure and put it on top of the map, that plate on map feature. Synthetic vision that we were looking at, that's also a Pro Plus feature. So you'll need the Pro Plus subscription for that. I mentioned the performance planning, so the more accurate numbers, that's all available in the performance subscription. The other features that are in the performance subscription that we looked at today were that 3D approach preview, so the ability to actually visualize the approach into Palm Springs in 3D. That's in the Performance Plus feature. In terms of what the actual feature breakdowns are per subscription level, on ForeFlight.com, if you go to ForeFlight.com/pricing, we have a very simple table. It's 3 columns for each of the plans, and it tells you what all the features are in each of those subscription plans. And the reason we have different subscription levels is because different pilots and different simulator enthusiasts care about different things, right? And so we want to make sure that we have really, really valuable features at different price points depending on what people care about. So ForeFlight.com/pricing is definitely the best place to go for more information on that.
Yeah, so another question about the georeferencing. What tells you when a chart is georeferenced? Is it just the ownership symbol?
Great question. So let me see if I can switch to my iPad here. Give me 1 second. So georeferencing is, like I mentioned, something that's available on the Pro Plus subscription. I'm actually not able to switch to my iPad right here, but I can visualize it. So the georeferencing, you can tell if a procedure is georeferenced in 2 ways. One is obviously if you see your GPS position on top of the procedure, yeah, that means it's georeferenced. But the other way is there is a blue box, a blue outline around a portion of the procedure. So on the taxi diagram, you'll see a blue box around pretty much the entire taxi diagram. On an approach, like let's say an ILS approach, you'll see a blue box around just a portion of the procedure. That is the portion that is georeferenced. So that's the quickest way. When you see a blue outline along an area of the procedure, that tells you whenever my GPS position is inside that area, I will see my GPS position on that chart. We get some questions on why the profile view is not georeferenced on like an ILS approach. And the reason is it's not drawn to scale, unfortunately. So the plan view is, and that's where you'll see the box drawn around it, but the profile view is not. So we unfortunately can't show your GPS position in the profile, but on the plan view, we can. So look for the blue box around the procedure. That tells you it's georef.
All right. Here's a question for Chris. As a student pilot, I've heard from other CFIs that students should not use the flight sim for landing patterns. Can you clarify why that is? And especially, ForeFlight has the ability to show the traffic pattern features. So, that's relevant to this question specifically.
Yeah, I think the tricky thing with landing in a simulator specifically doesn't necessarily have to do anything with ForeFlight. It's just that you don't have the visual cues you really need when you're going from approach to round out to flare and touching down, because a lot of that is in your peripheral vision and being able to visualize distance and how you're actually landing. Um, with all of that said, it does work in VR quite well if you have the VR option, which can work with the simulator. In that case, it's really difficult to use ForeFlight, so you're kind of talking something on the fringe here. But you can also basically do anything you want right now. I mean, we're all stuck at home. People need to keep their proficiency. Maybe you working on your radio calls in the pattern is something that will be really helpful, even though that final landing may not be. Speaking from personal experience, and Ryan, you can build off of this. I used simulators a ton as a teenager, and I feel like it helped me a lot more than it hurt me when it actually came to flight training. I just breezed right through flight training because I was used to talking on the radio. I knew how to turn the airplane. I knew how to climb, all those things. While I did have to learn how to land, the pros are much better than the cons.
I agree. I think the net positive for having simulator experience, even prior to going into real world aviation, is absolutely there. As you mentioned, Chris, there's a lot of things that just cannot be simulated, right? Things like true IMC and the landing experience and
Right.
G forces and turbulence and things like that.
Right.
However, just having that base experience and immersing yourself in the basic concepts in the simulator, if you're not a licensed pilot yet, that information can translate. And there's going to be things that you're going to have to that are going to be new to you transitioning into the real world aviation, and maybe some things that you've thought were the case in the simulator and then aren't the case in real world. For example, I think the landing experience is a great example of that. It's just different in the simulator.
Mm-hmm.
And but as a net effect, I think the simulator experience is definitely positive.
Yep.
Yeah, and Chris, related to what you said about VR, we got a very large number of questions about the possibility of using ForeFlight with VR. And I will say that as far as I know, there isn't any rock solid support for that. But I personally have seen some videos of people enabling that in various flight simulators. I can't remember which one, but if you're interested in learning about that, I would say you can search on YouTube, I think, to see if you can find that video. But it was a very cool implementation, but it was very strange looking also.
I know it's possible. There's some sort of third party that's able to bring the simulator, or rather the ForeFlight screen, into the simulator. But I always found it tricky when I was using VR, because obviously the point of using ForeFlight is to be able to manipulate the flight planning and all the other tools we've talked about. I mean, so that gets a little bit tricky, because then you have to take yourself out of VR and actually look at your real iPad to see where your finger goes. So I don't know. It just gets a little cumbersome. But for some people, they may be able to, they may like it if they're using VR.
Yeah. So next question here. Is there any way to file your flight plan in the simulator? So Ryan, can you talk, or Ryan or Chris, can you talk specifically about the relationship between maybe the do's and don'ts of filing flight plans with simulators?
Yeah, I can give you a really important don't first, and that is,
Right.
if you are planning a flight in ForeFlight, like we did at the beginning of the presentation, at the bottom of that screen is a big proceed to file button. If you are simulating a flight, you do not want to proceed to file. You do not want to file that flight plan. That's real world, and that's hooked up to the air traffic control system. And your airplane or your flight plan will be sent to air traffic control, and there will be questions and confusion and potentially problems. So if you're just simulating the flight, do not file that flight plan through ForeFlight. Now, if you're using a third-party tool like Pilot Edge, for example, in Pilot Edge, you file your flight plans through pilotedge.com. So you go on there and you file your flight plan. That's how the simulated air traffic controllers know about your flight plan. But the actual flight plan filing in ForeFlight is connected to the real world air traffic control system. And if you're just simulating a flight, definitely do not file it.
Ditto.
Yeah, that's important to note. There is no concept of fake flight plans within ForeFlight. Every flight plan you file is going to be as real as any actual flight plan. So, that's kind of the one part of ForeFlight that you definitely do not want to be playing around with. Ryan, what flight sim did you use in this webinar to record most of it, or did you use multiple ones?
So I used Prepared for this. I have all the major flight sims we talked about today, and I use each of them for different scenarios. But I used Prepared just because I had that one set up the easiest right now on my flight sim computer. And it's also the product that I probably have the most experience with. So that's what I was using.
And I use X-Plane myself. It just out of the box, it's a lot more flying ready than Prepared. Prepared goes a step beyond because they have a big third-party developer backing. So some of the scenery you were seeing from Ryan is actually stuff that other people have developed, and it's pretty impressive how good it looks. But right out of the box, if you're just looking to fly, I think, at least for me, I like X-Plane right out of the box better than Prepared.
I would agree with that. And, I would say of all the three we talked about, the easiest setup is honestly Infinite Flight, right? That's literally an iPad app you can download and run. But if you're talking about desktop simulators, yeah, X-Plane is probably the best out of the box experience.
All right, next up we have, here's a question about the hazard alerts. They said the terrain screen looks very helpful. Are there any voice alerts in ForeFlight for hazardous terrain?
Yeah, so all of the alerts in ForeFlight Mobile that show up visually on the screen, if you have that Speak All Alerts button on, it'll speak those alerts into your headset as well. So all of the alerts can be spoken to.
Here's a question that I think Chris might be able to answer. Any ideas for flight instructors to induce a lost scenario for a trainee using a sim, perhaps interrupting the GPS signal while altering the aircraft position in the sim? Do you have any ideas for how someone could possibly replicate that kind of scenario with a simulator?
Yeah, you can load up anywhere. There is an instructor station sometimes with simulators as well. So you can have your student essentially close their eyes just as you would if you're doing it in a real plane, get them disoriented. But during that disorientation, you essentially load the simulator, put them somewhere. And if you wanted to take away the tools from ForeFlight, you could disable all the network features. But yeah, I think I see two different ways to do it there, right? The traditional way, which I think is always important to try and show them, and then show them the power of the tool that they're using. So try it without and see how they can do, and then try it with so that they can actually manipulate the tools within ForeFlight to get found, go where they need to go. I think that's the most important thing to do. And this is one of the reasons I recommend ForeFlight for private pilot students, because I want to teach my students how to operate in the real world. Because when I let them go, when they get their check ride done and I kick them out of my nest, then I want them to already be using that tool. So I integrate both some of the old school methods, but also teach people the new school methods with ForeFlight.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there is one very useful setting in the settings section of ForeFlight under the More tab under Settings. The setting is called Enable Ownership. And so if you are flying with a GPS signal, either real world or if you're just connected to the sim and it's sending GPS across, and you want to, for a period of time, not show that GPS source on the map, just to build, VFR skills, you can just disable the ownership under settings and just turn it off.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I found that there's sometimes a couple other settings like the trend vector and the distance rings that you have to disable as well. But yeah, all that's really helpful if you're trying to teach your student pilotage or some other loss maneuver like that, loss procedure.
All right, and I'm going to go ahead and close it out here with one last question. Will we be able to see the recording after this is done? And I'll go ahead and take that one and say, yes, you can see this recording and a recording of any other webinar we do in this series if you just go to foreflight.com/onfrequency. It'll take me a few hours to get this recording ready to upload, but later this evening or certainly by tomorrow, if you go to that page and scroll down a bit, you'll find it embedded along with the last 2 webinars we've done. So if you missed any of it, or if for some reason the audio cut out for you, that's sometimes a problem, you can just go back there and view it anytime and send it to your friends. This is the first time we've done a webinar specifically about flight simulators. And so I'm sure it's going to be a great resource for learning about ForeFlight moving forward. So thank you again to everyone who joined. Thank you to Ryan and Chris. You guys were awesome, super informative. Are there any last comments you want to make before we sign off here?
I'll reiterate that. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. Really appreciate your insight into simulators, but also just the CFI perspective. I think that's so valuable. Thank you to everyone who has joined. As Sam mentioned, this is the first flight simulation specific webinar we've done. As you know, ForeFlight was developed for real world aviation initially, and we've been really pleasantly surprised at how well adopted the product has become among the flight sim community. And so that's something we're going to keep in mind in the future, and perhaps we'll do more of these like this. Chris, if people want to connect with you, talk more, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, I had you guys just put up my Instagram handle here, because everything I share there, from my podcast to my training videos to ground school stuff I do, it is all at Angle of Attack on Instagram, and that's a great place to find me. And I appreciate you guys having me on today. Ryan, I have a soft spot for simulation. I was there, I did it. I was in flight sim for a long time. Now my world is real training, and so I'm passionate about how these tools can help us become better, safer pilots. And of course, I'm using ForeFlight all the time as well. So the marriage of all those together is something I'm very interested in teaching, and you guys are going to see more from me coming that direction as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, and Chris, I think I saw a few comments come in from people who fly in Alaska, just telling us to give you a shout out. So I know you're popular up there.
Yep. Well, I'm excited to get flying again. In fact, I might go this afternoon. It's really nice today, so I might go up and fly around the mountains for a little bit.
Man, that sounds nice.
Yeah, it does.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Ryan, Chris, thanks everyone for joining. Like I said, foreflight.com/onfrequency if you want to see the recording of this webinar and sign up for other webinars. And with that, we'll see you all later.
Thanks, guys.